Calls for the British Prime Minister's top advisor, Dominic Cummings, to resign continue to grow inside Boris Johnson's own party. The journey Mr Cummings made during lockdown to isolate at his parents' farm in Durham with his family continues to draw fire despite his lengthy public explanation yesterday. At today's Downing Street briefing, the Health Secretary Matt Hancock announced that 134 people had died from coronavirus in the UK in the last 24 hours. But instead of talking more about the fall in coronavirus deaths, the Health Secretary found himself saying he would look at reviewing fines issued during the lockdown to people travelling for childcare.
Will the government review all penalty fines imposed on families travelling for childcare purposes during lockdown?
That's a very good question. I think, especially coming from a man of the cloth, I think that is perfectly reasonable to take away that question. I'll have to talk to my Treasury colleagues before I can answer it in full.
However, shortly after that briefing, Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor, was told by a government source Matt Hancock did not announce a review of fines of people in lockdown, just that he meant that he would pass concerns raised by Martin the Vicar on to his colleagues. The former Conservative Chief Whip, Mark Harper, and former Attorney General Jeremy Wright are among at least 30 Conservative MPs who've said publicly that Dominic Cummings should step down. Well, the backlash began with the resignation of the junior minister Douglas Ross, who was the Under-Secretary of State for Scotland. In a statement, he said, "I have constituents that didn't get to say goodbye to loved ones, families who could not mourn together, people who didn't visit sick relatives because they followed the guidance of the government." He went on to say, "I cannot in good faith tell them they were all wrong, and one senior advisor to the government was right." He spoke to the BBC later in the day.
Those were decisions others didn't feel they were able to make if they were following the government guidance. There was also one element that I just can't reason, and that's, if you are struggling with your vision, you don't tend to get in a car and drive for 30 minutes and then drive 30 minutes back again. So that was the area I really couldn't defend, and as a government minister you must be willing to defend the government policy and what the government are saying, and I wasn't able to do that, so I felt the only option left to me was to resign from government.
So let's remind you of what we heard from Dominic Cummings, who told the media yesterday that 4 days after the Prime Minister told the British public they must stay at home, his wife became unwell, possibly with COVID-19 symptoms. He went home to visit her, then returned to work. You may remember that the guidance at the time was if you think your partner has coronavirus, you must stay at home and isolate as a household for 14 days. That evening, Mr Cummings says they got into a car and drove 400 kilometres to Durham to his parents' home to isolate there. During that time, they took their son to hospital in Durham, fearing he had the virus. This happened at a time when London was a hotspot for the outbreak. Durham was not. Then, towards the end of their 14-day isolation, Mr Cummings drove to Barnard Castle, 48 kilometres from his parents' home, with his wife and child. He says that 97-kilometre round trip with his family was to test that his driving was fine before heading back to London because he was having problems with his vision. Well, during that trip, Mr Cummings was spotted by a retired chemistry teacher who has been speaking exclusively to the BBC.
When the Guardian story broke, I just thought, well, goodness me, that must have been that person I saw. And I didn't even think too much about it, but then people started these stories in the press saying, that he'd been there, and other people denying it and saying he was just stuck in his house all the time. And so I just looked up online to see history and found that those dates fitted with when he was meant to have been in County Durham, and I just read their Guardian article. I just emailed the person on it and just gave them the number plate. I mean, it could have been somebody who looked like him, but obviously if they said the number plate was his, then that confirms the story. As I said, not very keen on a great deal of publicity. I just agreed to. People were saying that, he'd been stuck in his house all the time, etc., and it just didn't seem quite correct.
Did you feel vindicated when you were at least acknowledged yesterday?
That word, yes. I felt vindicated, yes, because I don't know if they'd have mentioned it if I hadn't actually said that.
That's Robin Lees there talking about how he spotted Dominic Cummings and his family. Well, I've been speaking to our political correspondent Rob Watson about whether the growing pressure will force the Prime Minister to act.
The political crisis continues, no doubt, I think the biggest of Mr Johnson's political career so far. I think whether or not Mr Cummings survives depends on the dynamics of the Conservative Party. Will the rebellion continue? Will there be pressure, even more pressure for Mr Johnson to remove him? But I think actually whether or not Mr Cummings goes, I think permanent damage will have been done to the Prime Minister and the standing of his government, because first of all, you have the public, an awful lot of the public are angry at the government, but they're also laughing and mocking the government for what they see as double standards. And I think there's also this sort of seed of doubt within the Conservatives. You know, is their election and referendum winning hero really not very good at being Prime Minister? Now, you have to get all of this into perspective. Mr Johnson has an enormous majority of 80, and no doubt the Conservative Party will rally around him and the agenda will move on. The government's not about to collapse. But I don't think anyone doubts this will do serious damage to the reputation, lasting damage.
Well, Boris Johnson's cabinet have stood by the Prime Minister's chief advisor, and so has the Prime Minister. Dominic Cummings came up with the slogan "Take Back Control" while running the Leave campaign to take the UK out of the EU. He then devised the Get Brexit Done campaign that got Boris Johnson into power with a landslide majority in Parliament. During his statement yesterday, Mr Cummings cited media attention as one reason why he chose not to isolate at his home in London. Well, the Conservative MP, Miriam Cates, says his controversial status should be considered when judging his actions during lockdown.
We know that he is, he's a controversial individual, and his home, as he said, has become a target. And I think that before we judge him too harshly, and he himself has said that not everybody would make the same decisions in the same circumstances, but before we judge him too harshly, we must respect his right as a parent to protect his child in what were quite difficult circumstances compared to what some of the rest of us are facing. Everybody's facing tough circumstances, absolutely, but this was an exceptional circumstance.
Well, as you can imagine, a lot of conversation about what this means for Boris Johnson and anger over how this may have potentially hit Boris Johnson's popularity. One pollster explains.
It's about to conduct a daily tracker. We've been tracking opinion all about coronavirus and about all things associated with it since before the lockdown. And the data that we gathered yesterday shows that the government approval and that of the Prime Minister have absolutely plummeted. Both are now negative. I think the government is 2. Boris Johnson is -1, but that's come down from highs of +40, definitely +30 comfortably throughout the pandemic. So there really has been a quite swift change in public opinion.
Well, if you're watching this from outside of the UK, you might well be wondering who is in charge of the UK government and why the Prime Minister is reluctant to get rid of Mr Cummings. Here's more from Rob Watson.
I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that alongside Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings is the most important man in British politics. I don't think many people in British politics would actually dispute that. I mean, why is Boris Johnson holding on to him? I think there are 3 reasons. I think firstly, Mr Johnson's friends would say he's a loyal kind of boss. He doesn't want to fire anyone. But again, as you were suggesting earlier, Mr Cummings is more than just an advisor. I mean, he is the man, he was the brains behind the success of the Vote Leave campaign. He was the brains behind Mr Johnson's election victories. And I think it's often thought that while Mr Johnson is the fabulous salesman, that it's Mr Cummings who really does the detail. Mr Cummings has the big vision and the sort of drive to get policies through. And there's a third reason as well. And I think this is kind of important, actually, that if you think about Mr Johnson's operation at 10 Downing Street, it's the Vote Leave campaign revisited, which was, as we've discussed, headed by Dominic Cummings. Now, that is more than just about leaving the European Union. It's a sort of radical project for remaking the UK, for governing it in a different, they would say, much better way. So, I mean, although lots of people say that project was kind of crazy, given that Britain was 5th richest country in the world and seen as one of the sanest in Europe before the referendum. But, this is a serious project, and I think there is a certain sort of fear that if Mr Mr. Cummings was to go, that maybe the rest of the Vote Leave team would go, and that sort of project, for as they would see it, a renewal, a rebirth of Britain would be at stake. Because, you know, clearly, given the massive amount of political hit and capital that Boris Johnson is spending, it just tells you how important Mr. Cummings is to him and to the operation.